Within this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about emotions. Uh, the dichotomy of rational thinking and emotional behavior is part of Western intellectual history. Modern neuroscience, and particularly data collected on patients with specific types of brain damage, however, suggests that truly rational behavior is not possible without emotions. The importance of emotion in cognition and behavior is reflected in the tremendous elaboration in humans of the structures that comprise the emotional brain, as well as other areas of the limbic system, which are considered to be executive in nature and in function. The numerous interconnections between these and other structures suggest that emotion, memory, and cognition all participate to increase our adaptive behavior, our flexibility, our ability to meet the challenges of life, and in part by allowing meaning to be given to our experiences, which can then be used to influence and guide future behavior. So, emotions are very important. Philosophers, psychologists, neuroscientists have all pondered the role of emotion in human behavior. The Western philosophical tradition has historically ascribed to some type of dualism. For example, Rene Descartes is most notable, whether that be rightly or wrongly, for separating the mind and body. An extreme dualism sees emotional behavior as antithetical to rational behavior. What I want to do is explore a different view of emotions. That emotions, and in humans, the mental representations of emotions that we subjectively experience as feelings, are necessary for rational behavior. The evidence for such a hypothesis derives from experimental and also clinical data, as well as from philosophical inquiry. Most notable, Robert C. Solomon would be a good philosopher to take a look at in this area. Now, comparative neurology, which is essentially the study of the comparison of the brains of different animals, it clearly supports the conclusion that there's been an enormous elaboration and differentiation of the cortical areas involved both in emotion and in executive function within the human brain. For example, the orbital frontal cortex is one of the areas implicated in our ability to abstract and to apply to our behavior the mores of culture, the moral reasoning of a context. Other parts of the prefrontal cortex, for example, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, are also highly differentiated in humans and are believed to play a critical role in executive functioning. Other experimental data derived from the field of moral psychology, wherein individuals are asked to choose in a moral dilemma between one option or another. When studying this with an fMRI, a functional magnetic resonance imaging of the brain of the individuals, the brains of the individuals are studied to determine what areas are active during the moral decision process. The areas of the brain most activated under conditions are the areas of the orbital frontal cortex and other areas of the limbic system. When an individual making morally neutral judgments, these areas of the brain are not activated. So that orbital frontal cortex is clearly very important for making moral reasoning decisions. The conclusion that emotions play a role in rational judgment has also been made by many contemporary philosophers. Very importantly, also much of our understanding of the role of feelings in rational judgment has come from the clinic and from brain injury and traumatic brain injury patients. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about one particular patient and his experience. Now, the patient is known as Elliot. And he was initially described by Antonio Damasio in a work called Descartes' Error. Now, Elliot was a young man of high IQ who appeared to have undergone a major change in his personality after developing and then having surgery to remove a brain tumor. The damage to the brain involved both the prefrontal cortices, with more damage to the right than to the left prefrontal cortices. And damage also occurred to the axons beneath the prefrontal area. Now, one of the most dramatic consequences of this damage was Elliot's loss of emotions, or more specifically, his loss of feelings, or his own subjective sense of emotion. He was not able to tell and be self-aware of how he was feeling about a particular thing. There was no emotional meaning to contexts. What was the most enlightening thing about this case is that Elliot could no longer make rational decisions. Yes, he could make and discuss the pros and cons of various scenarios, so his rational ability and his intelligence quotient that could be measured appeared to be intact. But he could no longer choose between them. Without emotions, he could not weigh the various options. This decision-making difficulty was most pronounced in the social and personal realms. From this, as well as from other observations, a new paradigm has emerged, one which acknowledges that our feelings play a major role in our ability to make rational judgments. This is believed to be of enormous adaptive advantage since it allows learning and memory from previous experience and our feelings related to our experiences to influence our present actions. Without emotions, we, like the patient Elliot, cannot act in our own best interest, simply because we cannot weigh the information. So I want to transition a little to that emotion or internal subjective feeling that's generated in each of us, and this is the emotion of fear. And I want to touch on fear because it seems to be at the core of the key affective disorders, the key emotional disorders, which would be anxiety and depression spectrum disorders. Fear is a very powerful thing, and I want to look at the reasons why that is. A great deal of research in neurobiology has gone towards understanding the brain mechanisms involved. Strong emotions can be powerful to the point of paralyzing action. Now, all animals, however, they face threats to their survival, making it likely that brain mechanisms are there to help them to make a quick response to this threat. So I want to discuss what modern neuroscience is discovering about the critical role played by a small almond-shaped subcortical nucleus called the amygdala in the rapid processing of sensory information signaling threat. This emotion is interpreted by the brain and internally represented and experienced as fear. Activation of this nucleus is implicated in a number of disorders, including post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, we know that emotions play an important role in our ability to make rational decisions. While it is not known how the subjective feeling or internal representation of fear is generated, we've learned a great deal about the nuclei which are involved in the processing of stimuli which signal or pose a threat to the organism. The amygdala has emerged as the central player of the brain's circuit in which the stimulus is perceived as threatening and internal feeling of fear experienced by the individual. The amygdala is actually a large group of nuclei known as the amygdaloid complex that are part of the subcortical gray matter beneath the temporal pole. The function of the amygdala is to process sensory information in terms of emotional significance and to coordinate the action of a variety of systems which allow for an appropriate response. So the amygdala is critical in emotional memory and emotional processing. The amygdala has widespread and generally reciprocal connections to other parts of the brain, including the neocortex, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, and some nuclei of the extrapyramidal motor system. It receives a direct projection from the sensory nuclei of the thalamus. And this is important, so I'm going to say it again. It receives a direct projection from the sensory nuclei of the thalamus. Now, the thalamus is that coordinating center, so it bypasses the cortex and goes directly to the amygdala. And such pathways allow for the rapid response to a potentially threatening situation. So if you've ever had a friend that's hiding behind a door and you walk through the door and the friend jumps out and you immediately jump up in the air and your arms start flailing this way and that and you scream automatically, that is your amygdala telling you that you are in danger. And it's not until your cortex catches up and decides that there is not a threat that you start to calm down. So that tells us right there that there is a massive amount of information being processed automatically and emotionally that bypasses the conscious self. So in our psychotherapeutic treatment, there will always be a place for dealing with the preconscious, emotional, sensory interpretation of events, because it simply bypasses the cortex. Much of our understanding of this rapid processing system has come from studies looking at learned fear in animals. Now, in such studies, animals learn to fear something that is not intrinsically threatening. For example, rats learn to fear a grid on which they've previously received electrical shock. When you cannot know what the animal is feeling or experiencing, it will exhibit behaviors, including increased vigilance, rise in blood pressure, rise in catecholamine and cortisol release, all of which are parts of the stress response that prepares the animal for fight or flight. So we know from objective measures that the animal is experiencing fear. There are really 4 regions that have been shown to play critical roles in learned fear and in the unlearning of the fear response. The amygdala, as we've already mentioned, the removal of the amygdala, interestingly, results in the loss of the learned fear response. Animals will no longer show a fearful response to threatening stimuli, either learned or those that are really, truly intrinsically threatening. So it's clear that our amygdala is important. However unpleasant fear is, sometimes it's important to be afraid. The hippocampus. That seahorse-shaped part of the brain, this is an area that the amygdala is attached to, and this cortical region is critical for learning and memory. There's also the prefrontal cortex, and this area appears to be critical for unlearning the behavior. So it's the thing that tells the amygdala that the thing that it's afraid of is something that does not need to be. It does not need to be afraid of it. Now, the interesting thing is that even a small amount of damage to the prefrontal cortex can prevent unlearning of the response, and we've seen that in lesion studies with animals. And then there's various areas of the reticular formation. The areas of the reticular formation are known to play a role in selective attention. And these areas are also implicated in the shunting of sensory information directly from the thalamus to the amygdala. Now, in positron emission tomography scans and from functional magnetic resonance imaging, these research areas indicate that the same areas play a role in human disorders which experience heightened anxiety, panic, or fear. And that's where we get back into affective disorders, anxiety or depression. Individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, for example, show increased activation of the amygdala when experiencing attacks of panic and fear. Long-term sufferers of PTSD have shown a decreased volume of the hippocampus, which is due to likely to the prolonged stress response. As individuals with PTSD recover, there is an increased activation of the prefrontal cortex and a decreased activation of the amygdala. So the prefrontal cortex then becomes very important. So we can see that the prefrontal cortex is important for many areas, one of them being managing fear and ensuring that there are accurate representations of fear. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is also an affective disorder, a clinical disorder. This is to be differentiated from obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. Obsessive-compulsive disorder, as an anxiety disorder, involves many of the same areas of the brain. OCD is characterized by chronic obsessive thoughts, for example, fear of germs, and which leads to compulsive behaviors like hand washing. This disorder also underscores relations between cognition, emotion, and behavior. You see it all in individuals with OCD because they show an increased activation of the amygdala, the cingulate gyrus, which is medially located in the limbic cortical area, and the caudate nucleus, which is part of the extrapyramidal motor system, as we've talked about already, and decreased activity of the prefrontal cortex. And again, we see the prefrontal cortex as part of this. We look for higher prefrontal cortex to be indicated in times when there is less fear. Both psychotherapy and treatment with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor antidepressants can be effective in the treatment of this disorder. Clearly, they are both focused on the reduction of fear interpretations. The SSRI by directly inhibiting the fear interpretation, and the psychotherapy by indirectly influencing the appraisal of threat. Functional MRIs of patients benefiting from either treatment show a decreased activation of the amygdala, of the cingulate gyrus, the caudate nucleus, and an increased activation of the prefrontal cortex, just as we would expect to find. So in short-term threatening situations, it's obviously desirable to have a rapid and effective response. So if a tiger were to jump out of the woods, obviously it would be good to have a very quick physical response. But sadly, in our modern world, we often react to non-threatening stimuli like being stuck in traffic or having to stand in a line, and our body reacts as though our lives were being threatened, even though it isn't. And this produces a chronic stress response that has long-term deleterious effects on the body and the brain. These deleterious effects go right down to the level of the functioning of the blood. And Charles Nemiroff is a researcher that's shown very clearly that one of the best preventions for a heart attack is actually taking SSRIs, antidepressants. And because it changes the whole way that the system works. It reduces the fear arousal system and tells the entire body that life is okay. So, that's a little bit of emotions and the importance of emotions in our life experience and the biology of emotions, particularly of fear.